Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're talking about Numbers chapter 28, 29, and 30. And chapter 28 is about prescribed offerings. When I think about prescribed offerings, first thing I think of is some doctor writing me a prescription saying, here's what you got to do. If you're gonna live, here's what you got to do. It's a prescription for life. A prescribed sacrifice, a prescribed offering. Now, there were several kinds of offerings. There were offerings every single day. There were daily offerings, Sabbath offerings, monthly offerings, offerings for Passover, offerings for the Festival of Weeks. There were plenty of offerings. Like I said, every day was holy and thus was dedicated to the Lord. At the tabernacle, the entrance to the tabernacle, they would dedicate the day through the rendering of a burnt offering, a sacrifice for consecrating the day, so to speak. Both in the morning and in the evening, a lamb was sacrificed on behalf of the nation. Then, of course, like I said, there are Sabbath offerings and monthly offerings. Now we get into verses 16 through 25. These are the Passover offerings. Now, Passover, when I think of Passover, the first thing I think of is food. I think of Seder meals. I think of things like that. But Passover foods were the Passover lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. And there was a reason for that. These helped the people to remember the events that brought about the redemption of Israel from Egypt. The lambs were offered as communal sacrifices. The unleavened bread, which Deuteronomy calls the bread of hardship, reminded them of the hardships that they had there, and the bitter herbs were reminders of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. In this Passover, some elements are added to the celebration. In this passage here of Scripture, some elements are added to the celebration. A Sabbath designation of the first and the seventh day, that's added in here, and the final days of the festival of unleavened bread, complete with a sacred assembly at the sanctuary, and additional sacrifices equivalent to those offered on the new moon, like 2 bulls, a ram, 7 lambs, each accompanied by their appropriate grain and oil or libation offering together. A sacrificial list was complete with the offering of a goat for a sin offering on behalf of the people. Now, the Festival of Weeks. On the first day of the Festival of Weeks, it was called the Day of First Fruits. Now, it was considered a Sabbath day, and burnt and sin offerings were essentially the same as in the new moon sacrifices. The first fruits offering of the new grain harvest was included in the ritual practices for the day when the 7 weeks after the first sheaf that we talked about in Leviticus chapter 23 verse 10 were completed. The sheaves of new barley and wheat were elevated, and some were waved around to celebrate the Lord and the gifts of the harvest that they were given. Now in the New Testament, the Festival of Weeks is also called Pentecost, since the day is the 50th day after the first sheaf. I found that very interesting. Chapter 29, we begin with the Festival of Trumpets, of course, the offerings for the Festival of Trumpets, the offerings for the Day of Atonement, which is, of course, Yom Kippur, as they call it, and the offerings for the Festival of Shelters. Now, the beginning of the agricultural year in the 7th month on the first day was the beginning of the penitential season. The 10th day of the month was considered the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement. 5 days later, the Festival of Shelters began and lasted for a week. In early Israelite history, the 7th month was known as Ethanium, but when the Jews adopted the Babylonian calendar later on during the exile, the month was called Tishri. I found that fascinating. They just cooked and cooked and cooked They had festival after offering every single day of the year. There was a reason to make an offering to God. Do you make an offering to God every single day of your life? Do you live every day of your life as if you are sacrificing for God? Something to think about there. Now, chapter 30 gets us into regulations about vows. Now, this is where me and my wife get into arguments, because when I read this and then she reads this, she puts herself in a woman's situation and she gets mad. But when I read this, I put myself in a man's shoes and I go, well, maybe you shouldn't have done some of them things that I'm saying don't do. I don't know. She gets mad at me about this. But here's the gist of it all. In this section, the legal force of vows and oaths is set forth for both women and men. The force of a woman's vow was limited to her male guardian. That's where the arguments start in today's society and our culture today. Usually either her father or her husband. If the guardian was a passive or assenting, the vows of the woman had the same legal force as a man's vow. The vows of a widow and a divorced woman were also binding, and the statute also applied to a woman who was taking a Nazirite vow. Making vows was voluntary, but any man who made a vow or swore an oath to the Lord was required to fulfill his obligation. I think of that. I think about moral strength, and I think of integrity, and I think of people who were people of their words. Back in the day when a man would say, I'm going to do this, and his word was his vow. A vow is a promise. It's a promise that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. What are some vows that you think about? When you think of a vow, what do you think about? First thing that pops in my mind is a wedding. You make a vow to your wife. When I think of oaths, I think people who are going to court, they take an oath. They put their hand on a Bible. They take an oath and they promise to tell the truth. They promise to do something. And then at that point, they are expected to do it. God expects us the same way. God expects us to fulfill our oath. And when I think about that, and I think of integrity, and I think about an oath and a vow, either you do it or you don't. There's not any in between with a vow. Either you fulfill that vow or you don't. And then I'm reminded of the wise words of that great philosopher, Master Yoda. Do or do not. There is no try. So I'm going to leave you with that. If I missed anything or there's something you want to talk about, post it in the comments. Maybe post something about somebody that means integrity to you. Someone that epitomizes integrity or biblical integrity. Someone that's a man of their word or a woman of their word. Someone who always fulfilled their promises in your life. Maybe tell me a story about somebody like that. Maybe if you have one that's on your mind. Click that like button and that subscribe button. And of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And I will see you tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband, when we tackle Numbers chapter 31 and 32. I will see you then.